Welcome to Equilibrium Echoes, the podcast where we delve into the transformative power of your inner world on your relationships. I'm your host, Alyssa Decker. Join me as we unlock the secrets of emotional equilibrium and dig deep into the tools and insights needed to foster healthier, more fulfilling relationships in ways that feel safe and authentic. Welcome back to Equilibrium Echoes. My name is Alyssa Decker. I am your host, and I'm here today with a very special guest. I'm very excited for this conversation. I think I'm going to find it very informative and useful, and I think you will as well. So, Stacey, welcome to the podcast. Today we're talking to Stacey Sanderson. She is a registered psychotherapist from Canada. Her website is staceysanderson.ca. And Stacey, why don't you just take it over, take the reins, and tell us a little bit about yourself, what you do, and kind of how your journey has gotten you to where you are.
Great. Thank you so much for the introduction. So I work as a psychotherapist here in Ontario, Canada, and my niche area of expertise is in narcissism and narcissistic healing and recovery, where I offer a couple of online courses, a program, I do workshops, and I offer some group work as well as, of course, individual coaching and psychotherapy and consulting and facilitation around that as well. And the topic of emotional regulation is very much salient to any conversation you're going to have about any of the personality disorders, because they're characterized by someone being very emotionally dysregulated. And so as I'm talking about how people can create boundaries, the first place we start is on your own emotional regulation. So that's a little bit of the bread and butter of what I do.
Yeah, that's so true, isn't it? Because when we're in a relationship with someone with any of these personality disorders, how we show up very much affects the dynamic, and we can't change them. We can't change kind of what we're dealing with, right? We can only change ourselves. But what I learned was that the only way for me to be confident and safe and feel good inside my own body in this relationship was to learn how to regulate myself. Because I got really tired of, and I think a lot of people can relate to this, I got really tired of every encounter with this person leaving me with sweaty palms and nervous stomach, and my hands are shaking, and and it takes me an hour to feel normal again, right? So let's go back a little bit and define what is emotional regulation. What does that feel like versus what is dysregulation, and what does that feel like?
So essentially, as human beings, we have what's called a steady state, right? There's a calmness, if you will, or at least a neutrality in what we're feeling. And normally throughout the day, we'll have rhythms of that going up or down. We respond to different cues in our environment. We respond to our own inner monologue or dialogue as well. And some of us are aware of that. Some of us are very much aware of that. And other people are not so aware of that. So if you practice, for example, meditation, mindfulness, yoga, those are things that help us build an awareness of our inner emotional experience, or when I'm teaching meditation, I call this the inner emotional landscape. It has subtle aspects of what's going on with the central nervous system and to what extent your fight and flight response is fired up.
Okay. So for me, I have constant internal dialogue, and I'm constantly self-analyzing. That has a lot to do with my personality type. Like, I know not everybody is like that. But for me, part of being dysregulated was that internal conversation. Part of being regulated also, like, I think this is why I'm so passionate about this topic that we talked about in this podcast about managing your internal world, because both regulation and dysregulation for me start with that internal conversation.
Yes.
So when someone's feeling dysregulated, like when they're in a situation where they're feeling dysregulated, how do you start to recognize, oh, this is what's happening, right? Especially for someone who's not so self-aware or maybe just doesn't have that internal dialogue.
Yes. Many years ago, I would refer to this as the yuck, right?
I like it.
So, yes, it's effective. It works with kids. So when you're, let's say you're in your own thought spiral or your own thought process, or you're talking to someone else and you notice that there is tension being held somewhere in your body, typically it's anywhere from neck, chest down into the solar plexus. So that's one way. And when you are having a shift in your natural equilibrium, right? So you might feel a little bit more anxious. You might feel a little bit more irritated, right? But you just don't feel like yourself. That's an indicator that you've moved into dysregulation. I need to separate that out from mood, right? That's separate from, although contributes to your overall mood state.
Right. Yes. That makes sense. It wasn't really for me. It isn't so much about mood at all. It's really about like that stress and tension and anxiety. Like I noticed for me, one of the things I started to notice as I really started paying attention to this is like when I would get a text, for example, in my case, it was like my ex-husband's on the way to pick up the kids, right? My whole body would get tight. Like my palms would start getting sweaty. And I would be unable to sit still. Like I would get up and clean. Usually it was I would get up and clean, which I suppose is fairly productive. But I wasn't doing it from a good place, right? I was doing it because I was like immediately on edge and anxious and just had like, I mean, I can feel it in my body now just thinking about it. So when we start to recognize that we're getting into this place of dysregulation, talk to me about that internal dialogue. Like, what are some places to kind of take that in your head and start processing what's going on?
That's a great question. I think it begins with a gentle kind awareness of what you're feeling moment by moment. And you want to do that check-in or that inquiry when you're calm, when you feel safe, right? When you're in your happy place. Maybe it's, that morning cup of coffee or tea, right, as the day begins, because you want to recognize that as your baseline.
Okay.
Even happiness and joy is a good baseline, but we'll begin with peace. So when you have that awareness, you start to become more attuned to subtle shifts or changes in that level of peace. And we don't catch it quite as well if we're ambushed or surprised, or if it is something that is triggered from previous experiences with a person or with a situation, right? I was driving, ironically, to attend a meditation class on Monday, and coming around a cul-de-sac, someone almost cut me off, and it rattled me,
Mm-hmm.
as it should have.
Right.
And it took me a little bit longer to settle into, the practice that was happening that night. So if you think about, this steady state of emotion that's in a straight line, if we become more anxious or upset, we can think of that visually of then spiking up, and then it might level off, and then it comes back down again. And that's fairly typical. We have a natural uh, need to be in a little bit more of an even keel. And so, but being curious, being a little bit detached from what you're experiencing, and being that kind, compassionate observer of what you are feeling is how you start to practice that.
Yes. Awareness is the first step, right?
Yes.
So why do our bodies dysregulate like this? What is, like, I'm a firm believer in, like, your body, you got to listen to your body. Your body's trying to tell you something, right? What is dysregulation trying to tell us? Like, what is our body doing when we're experiencing this whole this
There
whole
are a
thing?
few different ways of answering that. It is completely normal to have a an unconscious physical response first to something that's going on. Or even if we have a memory that comes up that's distressing, it is part of our inborn survival mechanism to begin with, right?
Mm-hmm.
So although we'd like to think, we're fairly sophisticated as human beings, our central nervous system, that primitive part of the brain, the amygdala and the hippocampus, they do not know, if I can characterize it that way, that we've been upset by someone or that we're being chased by a lion. Like, it cannot differentiate that. And if you've had early experiences, particularly where you needed to be on a level of alert to keep yourself safe or okay, you're going to have, even more, or a hypervigilance of things, and then a hyper response, right? So, we think back to babies and how their startle system is evaluated early on, and that continues to stay true for us. So that startle response that is key when we're babies continues to function, throughout the rest of our lives. And then that's influenced by our experiences and relationships.
So what is, trying to think of how to put this. What's the difference between occasionally experiencing something that is startling or triggering or, like, gets our heart racing, gets some adrenaline going, like your traffic incident or near incident, versus a pattern where we find ourselves consistently dysregulated? Like, how do we go from just this normal, healthy nervous system reaction to feeling like we have these situations where we're constantly in a state of dysregulation?
Yes. That being constantly in a state of dysregulation is really due to the central nervous system, the stress response system being on overdrive. I met with someone yesterday who was talking about, she can't even log into her email now without feeling anxious or having a sense of panic because she's in such a state of stress, right? So a little bit of that nervous system firing is good. It's fine. It's what we need to get through life. But if it is sustained and extreme over time, the body adjusts to that, and you will get either a sense of overwhelm and shutting down and being numb, or a sense of overwhelm and then going into a state of anxiety or panic or agitation or irritation.
Okay.
So it's
So
kind of like a little bit is okay, too much is going to be a tipping point,
that's true of a lot of things in life, isn't it?
like sugar.
I mean, even conflict, right? Even
Yes.
conflict in our lives, we need a certain amount of conflict to learn how to manage it, to develop healthy communication techniques, all those things. But too much, right? Um, food, any number of things you can say that about. And that is really, I think, one of the hard things sometimes is always seeking that place of moderation. So when someone is in this situation, they're starting to feel like, gosh, like I'm overwhelmed, I'm constantly anxious. Like, I think for a lot of people, this exploration of the idea of regulation and dysregulation starts from that place of like, I am always stressed out and anxious, and this is not okay. Like, I got to do something about this. Like the woman you were telling us about who was having anxiety just opening her email. Like I have been there, done that. Like there's that feeling of, what if I open my email, or I look at my phone and there's a text, or there's an email, or there's a whatever, right? You're anxious about being anxious, before anything has even happened. Right.
Yes.
And so once we become aware of that, and we kind of start to dig a little deeper, and we're like, I got to do something about this. Like, what does that process look like? How do we kind of take some steps down that path to start managing?
I think, as you said earlier, the first step is awareness. And what goes along with that is prioritizing your inner peace as the most radical form of self-care there is. The quality of our lives, the quality of our relationships is very much influenced by our level of emotion, or if you will, our inner emotional vibration. So those are the two steps. And I think it's giving ourselves permission to be in this place of peace as often as we can be.
Yeah.
And we do this by being able to check in with self-inquiry, which looks a little like, what am I feeling? Why am I feeling this? Why is this coming up? And what do I need to do to move into more of a place of peace? Or sometimes I'll say to clients, where's your level of stress on a 0 to 10 scale? So if it's at a 5, what do you need to do to bring that down to, say, a 2, right? We have to be a bit reasonable in how we're going to be able to do that, right? So it's kind of like a music scale, if you will, right? That visual just came to me. And then you create, or, visualize this little kit of strategies that you can rely on. One of them is being comfortable. One of them, it might be taking a break from what you're doing. This sounds basic, but it's so true. Remembering to eat enough, drink enough. You can use breath work. You can use your body. If you're holding any kind of tension or upset in your body, you can stretch, move, do what you need to do to move the energy of that emotion. Under stress, the bodies need to move, our bodies, right? So that's a simple little thing that you can do. If I wake up in the morning and I've had too much caffeine, because it happens, or, I'm a little bit keyed up, I will go for a run just to balance all of those neurochemicals and have a reset. So the most important thing is really prioritizing that. And you want to bring that level of distress down before it gets to an 8 or a 9 or a 10. If you instantly go from 0 to 10, then you definitely have to move as a strategy. You can't think your way through it.
It's probably why I started cleaning, because it was kind of a way of releasing that tension in my body.
And I, for the record, think that's a good strategy. When we can do anything where we see a beginning and a middle and an end, or we see a productive result of what we've done, I think that's incredibly helpful.
Yeah.
Right? So if one of the things that's causing us distress is we're caught up in kind of obsessing or ruminating or worrying, we've got to check in and see if that's going to come to any kind of positive outcome, or if that worry is being productive. If not, move the energy by doing something that is tangible, doing something that is sensory. If wash the dishes, sweep the floor, pick the weeds, now that it's spring, but you want to do something physical. If I'm working, I'm in my office, I might organize stuff, right?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does, because it's a way of getting that, working that out of your body. Whereas just sitting and ruminating about it doesn't help. It just perpetuates the cycle. And so talk to me about like these really high conflict relationships, these situations like clients that you work with. What does this look like in those kind of relationships? Specifically, like especially with an intimate partner where
Yes.
there's no going anywhere, right?
The typical scenario is you have one person who's more of the toxic character, who is dysregulated all the time and lacks awareness. So then their default is to blame and project on the other person, who more often than not is highly empathic and has a lot of internalized blame. So then they take that on. So, that tends to be the cycle of that conflict, right? You have no awareness paired with too much awareness, if you will. So that's on that relational level. On an energetic level, if someone is really dysregulated all the time, if they're on edge, if they're irritable, anxious, not, I'm going to pull back on the anxious one because that doesn't tend to happen. The other person is going to feel that because they want to be safe. They want to feel safe. They want to do the right thing. They want to get the love that they need. So they're going to adjust their own inner experience. Or they may even pick up on or catch the feeling of that other person,
What
right?
do you mean? Can you explain what you mean by that? Like
By catching the
catching
feeling,
the other person's feeling?
you
Yeah.
feel it with them, like you take it on.
Is that why, like, when someone is angry and they start yelling, your tendency is to yell back because you're picking up that anger
Yes,
emotion?
that plus the fight and flight response system.
Right.
But
Okay.
many,
Yeah.
many people are hypersensitive to other people's emotions and moods, if you will, because of their own early childhood experience.
Gotcha.
And it
That
can
makes
come out in
sense.
a lot of ways. Yeah, did I answer that question adequately?
Yeah. Yeah. I'm just thinking, and again, I only have my own experience to draw on here, but I know that for me, I would tend to shut down and internalize everything that was being said, whether it was true or not, right? I took on all the responsibility for the relationship, at least internally. And that created, like, I was giving myself so much, putting so much responsibility for the relationship on myself that, and taking responsibility for things that I had no control over. Um, and that is a really hard, I think, internal loop to break out of, right? Because when you feel like you're responsible for everything and you're in a relationship with a person who's telling you that you are in fact responsible for everything, it tends to be this loop of like, and for me, it just escalated. And every time I would think I was doing better, then I would be told that I wasn't. And then I would try harder and then I would try. And all of that anxiety and stress that built up added to this dysregulation and all the things that were going on. So when we get in these cycles, right? Because I think we all do this on some level. We get in these behavioral loops in our relationships that sometimes are great and healthy, but oftentimes are not. Like, talk to me a little bit about that. And especially because I think a lot of women have a similar experience to me where they're putting a lot of responsibility on themselves that maybe isn't theirs, right? And it just keeps escalating and they feel more and more not just dysregulated, but that mental
Yeah.
conversation with
Yes.
themselves becomes more and more negative. And how do we break out of that and start recognizing what really is our responsibility and how we can get out of that vicious cycle?
That's a great question. The most important thing to consider is the idea of the other person's capacity for good enough, right? or enough. So like if you think about the Staples easy button, this is a weird analogy, but stay with me. Some people don't have an enough button.
Okay.
And you could, bend over backwards. You could bring all the compassion and empathy you have. It isn't you that is shortchanging in that relationship. It's the other person's capacity to receive and to feel like something is enough.
Yes. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Because the reason why I say this is it's putting the focus where it needs to be, which is on the other person's maladaptive relationship skill or lack thereof versus your own perceived inadequacy.
Yes, that's so true. When I finally figured this out, it was like a year after my separation. I sat down with my husband's therapist. He had signed a paper and that I could go and talk to her. And I explained some things that I was really ruminating and trying to figure out. And she said, Alyssa, like, none of that was ever going to work because he doesn't have the capacity to emotionally connect with you.
Mm-hmm.
And I went, oh, like the fireworks and light bulbs and everything else went off because it explained so much to me. Like every time he would tell me, you're not loving me. You don't love me well enough. I don't feel loved. I don't this, I don't that. And I would try harder. Right. But it wasn't, I'm now looking back, realizing it never was about me or my effort.
That's right. So just take a moment and just, get a sense of you and I speaking here in this moment. We're actively listening. We're, listening to respond rather than react. We're very attuned to one another and what we're saying. But imagine that process if one of us was really angry all the time, right?
Yes.
Imagine how different that would feel. So it can feel like this other person is angry with us, and maybe sometimes they are. But more often than not, it's just their inner default way of being.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. For him, I think in this case, there was trauma way back in his childhood, and emotional connection had been a problem his entire life. Right. But I married him not knowing that. Like, took me like 20 years to figure that out. Okay. So I want to go back to this idea of dysregulation. And it's a word that's like tossed around a lot now on social media, and we've kind of broken down what it is and what it looks like and how the first step is becoming aware of what's going on. For me, the second step was giving myself permission. And again, I recognize this is probably very different for a lot of people, the process. But for me, that second step, once I realized what was happening, was to give myself permission to just stop responding, like stop engaging. We would be out in the driveway having a conversation and he'd be yelling. And rather than trying to defend myself, I just stopped. Like I would just go silent. Yeah. I didn't walk away yet. I mean, there are things that I do now that I wasn't capable of doing then, but all I could do at that point was just give myself permission to stop talking, stop engaging. And that gave me space to, sometimes it looked like I was standing there in my driveway, tears pouring down my face, shaking, he's yelling, and that all I could do was say, you don't have to respond, right? You do not have to respond. So it's baby steps, isn't it? Like when we're trying to work through this, sometimes to me, that felt like a step backward. Because I felt like I'm not defending myself. I'm not making this better. I'm not doing anything to fix it. But I was. Because that was the first step for me in like disengaging and starting to be present in my own body and all those things. So talk to me a little bit about that. Because I think sometimes, healing isn't linear. We don't, like sometimes all this can feel like 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Like, I'm not doing enough. Like, just, I'm trying to figure out how to phrase a question here, but like, give me some practical, like, for someone who's in these kind of situations, right? What do you do? Like, what are some action steps that we can sink our teeth into to stop breaking these cycles?
I really loved what you said about this beautiful moment of personal agency where you decide you have a choice.
Yes. Yeah.
Huge. The other thing, this is a strategy I use with clients, and it's a chapter in my book, is compassionate detachment. So, this is when you have a context or an attitude, right? And if I can use that word, of being very radically kind toward yourself and then extending that kindness and compassion toward the other person. And it's not for them, it's for you. And
Mm.
it's creating a higher emotional vibration, if I can use that language. It's neutralizing the conflict, and it's giving you something to bring you back into that place of equanimity or that place of peace. Please don't think I never get angry. I do. I have quite a, it is where I default to, right? But it's you don't want to drop into that same emotional level as that toxic person. So, and you're also in a way recognizing their inner turmoil, right? That it's got not necessarily anything to do with you, but that you have a right to feel peaceful. So, compassionate detachment is one. Posture is key, and breath work, right? So you want to stand a little taller, feel your feet on the ground, straight line between the top of the head and the sit bones, strong back, open heart, right? So you're working with the best possible physiology to take care of yourself in that moment, right? That's not what most of us do. Most of us do this. We collapse in on ourselves,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Or we go into a complete fight stance. But this is, just as an adult would do with a child, you're embodying, this large and in charge way of responding, right?
Yes.
Really
Yes.
we're coming into your own sense of personal agency.
Right. And there's that is, first of all, that was so important for me. Like, it was super pivotal for me to get to that place where I was like, I actually don't have to engage with this. Like, and even when someone else is telling me I have to, no, I don't. Like, I really don't. And that, as someone, when you're the kind of personality that takes responsibility for everything and everyone all the time, that can be huge. But the other side of that is, with personal agency, is like, that delineation of like, what is my responsibility and what is not my responsibility. And so I like those tips that you had about posture, because and feeling grounded in your body, like all of those things, it's all connected, right? Our mind and our spirit and our emotions and our body, it's all connected. And staying really grounded in what's happening right now, what am I feeling, what is my body doing, all that is a big part of emotional regulation.
So ask yourself, whose feelings are you really responsible for?
Yes.
Right?
Yep.
Just yours.
Just yours. Yep. And whose actions and words are you really responsible for, right? Part of the cycle that I had to break was that taking responsibility for how he was feeling, and just recognize that, he gets to have his own adult experience. He gets to have his own emotions, whatever that looks like. And it's not my job to manage that for him.
Not only that, but you can't.
Right. Yeah.
You experience
you
that.
can kind of maybe delay things a little bit. That's what I found myself doing. Like, for a long time, I would tell myself, like, I'm keeping the peace here. But the truth was, all I was doing was delaying the inevitable explosion that was going to come at some point, regardless of what I did.
Managing the moment.
Right. Yes. And that's a whole thing too. Like, that's a whole process of like retraining your thought processes when you are constantly taking responsibility for things that are not your responsibility, it's hard because it's so ingrained in you that it's your responsibility to take care of everybody. And especially as women, we're responsible for taking care of our children. We have this nurturing aspect to our personalities. And I'm not saying that men can't. I'm just saying I think it's easier for women to fall prey to this vicious cycle of, I have to take care of everybody. So yeah, I think all of this is so interconnected. And when we start to really break it down, I feel like it's sort of like pulling back the curtain in The Wizard of Oz. Right? Once you see it, you can't unsee it. And once you start down this path of doing this work, there's really no going back, because you start to see how all the pieces fit together and how everything is connected. And, once I started going, hold on a minute, there's something going on here that is not right. It was like there was no going back to that blissful ignorance. Not that it was blissful, but when I was living in that and I didn't recognize what was happening, it was a completely different dynamic, I guess, than when I did start to recognize what was happening. So tell me a little bit about, with your practice, like, who do you work with? How would someone identify themselves as someone who would be a great fit to come and work with you?
Yeah, I have two distinct sets of people, and they have a bit of an overlap. I work with people who are wanting to learn about themselves, learn skills of self-awareness, self-compassion. So I work with people who've been in, toxic or narcissistic relationships. We can call us survivors, I suppose. That's one group. And then the second group of people I work with are people who are very gifted, people who are highly sensitive, people who are empathic. I work with a lot of people who are healing professionals, therapists, all different kinds of holistic modality types of folks, because many of them have experienced narcissistic wounding. It's uncanny, actually. And so it's really those two groups, and I really meet them where they're at, and we figure out, a path for their healing and recovery that is tailored to them.
Gotcha. Can you define empathic for us? Because I think that's another word that's kind of thrown around a lot on social media, but maybe not completely correctly understood.
I agree. It is thrown around a lot. From my standpoint, I look at the concept of being an empath as being rooted in trauma theory. So you have a young person who needed to learn to read the body language, emotions, temper, mood, tone of the room when they were really young, like really young. And then they developed this capacity to do that. We all have the potential. It's just not all of us need it to survive. Right? So when I'm talking about an empath, that's what I'm referring to. It isn't someone who has like an extrasensory gift. It isn't in the same ilk as being audiovoyant, clairvoyant, psychic, a medium. It occurs on a relational level. And empaths as a group of people have some very unique traits. They need time alone. They need time in nature. They need things around them to be in order, right? Just going back to how we used to clean. And unfortunately, there's no space for that right now in psychological canon, right? It's not a technical or clinical term, but it is a cluster of traits, much like narcissism or any character pathology, that need to be taken care of. So that's how I think of an empath. An empath can sense what someone is feeling. Empaths, for example, are very affected by very terrible images in news media. They feel the pain of the world, of animals, all of it. But it is in my opinion, does not refer to someone who has an extra special gift or ability. I'm not saying it's not a gift, but it's something we all have capacity for, but some of us had to rely on it more than others.
And it's not necessarily all a positive thing, right? There's a downside as well, I think, because we can get so overwhelmed sometimes by what we can sense or feel from other people, or one of the things I see on social media that I think can be really a negative is when this is like, when being empathic or being an empath is seen as like this great virtue, right? Like, and it can be, certainly, but we forget that there's a big downside to that as well, like for that person. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, and I've talked about that a lot over the years, that it can drain your energy, it can be exhausting, it can influence where you feel safe and loved and a sense of belonging and you don't. It influences all of those things. It can make you have a significant internalized sense of blame or responsibility as well.
So being an empath is also like very connected to this idea of emotional regulation and dysregulation. Like when you're an empath,
Definitely.
It becomes that much more difficult
Yes.
to stay regulated.
What a great point.
Yeah.
Yes, it sure does.
Because you're not just regulating your own emotions, you're in some respects having to deal with other people's emotions in a greater capacity than other people might have to.
Most definitely. And at different levels of consciousness and inner wisdom.
Yes.
Right?
So what is the goal when someone is like kind of heading down this journey of like, there's a lot of stress, there's a lot of anxiety, they're feeling dysregulated frequently, they may be in a high conflict relationship. Like, give us a little picture of like, what can it look like when you go through this and do this work? I know it's a process, right? There's no end goal, so to speak. We're always a work in progress. But what are we working towards? Like, give us that picture of what things could be like.
I think that it is moving toward the goal of living life joyfully. If I had to really map it out, it is this realization that living a life where you have inner peace, joy, where you're really getting the most out of life is going to be the best emotional regulation strategy you're going to have. It is also the most powerful boundary. So if we think about some toxic people as being thieves of joy, which they are, it makes sense that, on like the end goal of self-regulation is to come to a place of peace, equanimity, contentment, and joy. And from there, everything else in life flows more easily.
Right. It's not that it's not that everything becomes easy. It's not even necessarily that the conflict goes away or the situation goes away. But for me, I've now gotten to this place where my ex-husband can show up. He can say whatever he wants to say. He can do what he's going to do. Right. And one of the ways that I knew that I had made a great deal of progress was when I could see the text that he was coming, deal with him when he came, and by the time he left, I felt the same as I did before we even began that whole engagement, right? Like, it didn't take me, there was no recovery process, it was just flatline is a bad word, but like I didn't feel a big up or down. I didn't have a big physical reaction anymore. It was just, all right, well, here he is. He's going to do what he's going to do. Right. And I thought several times, I just want to throw this in here at the end because I think this was so helpful for me. My therapist gave me this visual illustration of, do you remember back in the 80s, 90s, there was the Looney Tunes cartoon with the Tasmanian devil, and he would spin him. He'd get mad. He'd spin himself around a little tornado. And she said to me one time, she said, Alyssa, he's going to have those tornadoes, right? It's not your job to stop them or to fix them or to anything. She said, all you need to do is back up enough that you don't get sucked in.
Just observe it.
Just observe. Think to yourself, oh, there he goes having his little tornado again, right? And I'm going to stop sticking my foot in the tornado because it's not going to fix it. It's only going to hurt me to do that. And I have thought about that dozens of times in the last couple of years. It's been so helpful for me to have that visual, like, and even that wording, like, just, I do think to myself, sometimes I'm like, oh, there he goes again, having his little tornado, right? But I've now gotten to the point where that's the extent of my emotional reaction to it. And I'm able to stay in my peace and my joy, regardless of how many tornadoes he decides to have in a given interaction. So I just wanted to throw that out there because I have found that so helpful to have that visual illustration. I even looked it up at one time on YouTube and watched a little clip to see that. So it was fresh in my mind. I remember watching it as a kid, but I'm never going to see it the same way again now that she said that.
No, but it's such a helpful metaphor and imagery, right?
Yes.
And we can just be that little kid again watching that cartoon, and isn't that kind of funny?
Yeah, none of us got upset about it when we were watching the cartoon, right? We were like, oh, he's mad again. That could be a really helpful tool. And I think it can be so helpful to have those visual things, those visual illustrations in our head to kind of help keep us grounded and give us that perspective.
I 100% agree. And it's also having that awareness of what's going on with someone else, and then you can detach from that and take care of yourself. And I think that's really vital, right?
Right, definitely. Because part of that really is acknowledging he's going to have his tornado with or without me. I just got to stay out of it. Like, not my responsibility, but also not my problem.
No. And you're not in trouble, right? You're not in trouble in that moment. Our little inner children need to know that we're not in trouble in those situations.
We didn't cause it. It can't hurt us if we stay out of it. I mean, it can if we allow it to, but and again, I also want to say, like, for some people there is an issue of physical safety, and if you're in a situation where someone is violent or abusive, like, don't stay in that situation. Get yourself to safety. Get some help. But what we're talking about here are primarily the emotional and verbal dynamics in a relationship.
Yeah, quite true. If there's a physical threat, you do need a safety plan of some sort.
Yes. All right. So tell me how people can find you and how they can connect with you and get some more information about what you do and how to work with you.
Probably the easiest way would be, again, to go to the website, staceysanderson.ca. And that's going to give you the links to the socials. My blog is there, and link to my YouTube channel, where I kind of drop in and talk about the things that I feel inspired about. And there's lots of information there if that interests people.
Excellent. Well, I will put all of those links in the podcast notes as well. So if you're interested in connecting with Stacey, scroll down and look for that. Thank you so much, Stacey, for this conversation. It was really helpful, informative. I think a lot of people will really identify themselves in this conversation and have some useful information to help them move forward in their journey.
I hope so, and you're most welcome. It was a pleasure spending some time with you today.
Thanks for joining me for another episode of Equilibrium Echoes. If you would like to learn more about the podcast, visit www.coachingwithalyssa.com/podcast. And while you're there, book your free consultation and download the preview of my new book, Marriage is Hard and Other Lies I Believed. I'll see you in the next episode.